Hi, my name is Dr. Erin Thompson. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm the founder and director of the Loss Foundation, a national bereavement charity specialising in supporting people who've had a loved one die from cancer. Now, although we specialise in cancer bereavement, we actually have a range of resources that are applicable to people who've experienced any type of loss. And what I wanted to come on to tell you about today was our holiday grief workbook. It's a big chunky one. We have so much in here that can be helpful for people who are grieving over the holiday period. And I wanted to sort of talk through some of the areas that we have in here so you could get familiar with what kind of support we have available for you within this workbook. Now, grief is hard at any time of year, but there is really something about this Christmas period. Christmas is all about family time, and we see it on the adverts, people all huddled around a table, big full family, lots of happy faces. And for those who get that experience, that is beautiful and lovely, and yet we know that not everybody has that experience, and that there are a lot of people who will be entering this Christmas period without someone special that they're used to having there. Now, be this your first Christmas or your 25th without that special person, it can be really challenging. The Christmas time can be full of so much pressure, and we can be quite hard on ourselves, and grief can feel increasingly isolating during this time. Which is why we have this. This is designed to help you as best as possible. Now, I've pulled on a few different areas that I wanted to kind of bring to your attention in case it would be helpful for anyone, just to get an idea of the different contents we have in here. Now, it's really full, but one of the areas we have right at the beginning of this workbook is what we call models of grief. Now, there's no right way to grieve. It's one of those things. It's completely universal. We know that we all go through grief, unfortunately. It's a very human thing, and yet it is completely unique and completely individual. But sometimes we like to share at the Loss Foundation different models of grief. Now, all we mean by that is different ways that you can actually visualise the grieving process, kind of as a way of saying, gosh, where am I in my process, and what about that area? And it's also a way of kind of acknowledging that you're probably doing the best you can with what you have. Now, there are so many grief models, and the one that most people have heard of is the 5-stage model by Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, incredible woman. She did a lot of work in end of life and palliative care. And that 5-stage model was actually a model that was designed to describe the stages that someone goes through towards the end of their life. Not so much for the person left behind who is grieving. And that model talks through people going through these 5 emotions: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Now, some people find that model very helpful, even though it's not specifically a grief model. And if you find it helpful, that is absolutely fine. However, here at the Loss Foundation, we love evidence-based stuff. We're very interested in learning about what people really identify with and what people tell us that they find particularly helpful. And there are a couple of other models that people tend to find a little bit more respectful of individual differences and a little bit more in line with individuality. One of which is the sometimes called kind of the circle model, the jar model. And this one here is really talking about, I guess, our expectation of what happens to grief over time. You know, when grief comes into our life, it's not unusual for people to feel like grief shadows everything. It's taken over everything that I'm experiencing and doing. And that would be a really normal, healthy response to losing someone you love, where you feel completely consumed by your grief. You might be having frequent thoughts about your loved one, lots of memories about things that happened, maybe even physical sensations of loss, maybe a real intense yearning for them and separation distress. All completely normal. Now, sometimes we hear the kind of language from people, when will it go away? When will I get over this? Typically that get over this phrase is often used by other people around us, not those grieving themselves. But it all points to the same question is, gosh, when will this get easier? When will this become more manageable? And what the jar model or the circles model is talking us through is that maybe it's not about this grief actually getting smaller, but us slowly learning to build our life around our grief, which may in turn make it feel a bit smaller. But grief, as I'm sure many of you tuning in will know, is such a meaningful part of our lives. And it would be fair for me to make a generalisation. In working in grief for 15 years, that I do notice that sometimes that acute, raw feeling of grief does go a little bit over time. But grief is very much a representation of our love for someone. And therefore, it's going to forever remain meaningful. And so this model is less about grief going away and more about helping us think about, how do I grow a meaningful life that feels worth living around my loss? It's just one of a few models, and one that really helps us reflect on expectations of grief. And on that note, there is no expectation to be building a life around grief without actually spending time processing our grief, getting support in it. We can't build a life around something we avoid. Just one model there in this book for you to kind of think about and reflect on. And then what we have in here is we have a plethora of kind of tips, pages of them really, for how to manage grief over the holidays. The reason we have given so many tips is this is not a one-size-fits-all. Gosh, if only it was, then we could say to you, do these 5 things and this period will be easier. But that's not the case. And so we try to give more information and recommendations in recognition that really there might only be a few that work for you, but we have to find them. Now, as with most of these kind of tips around self-care and looking after ourselves, often it's kind of the thing that we might kind of hold in mind and know that, I should look after myself by doing this or this. But actually we're quite bad at looking after ourselves, especially when we're struggling. And typically the kind of self-care is the kind of thing that goes off first, because maybe life is feeling very overwhelming already. So doing some of those basic self-care things actually might be a really big challenge. And I guess that's part of what this workbook is about. It's exactly that. It's a workbook. And so we really encourage you to kind of work through it, also as a way of holding yourself accountable for self-care, for looking after yourself, for having a space to honour your grief, work with it, make room for it, connect to your loved one and look after yourself in the process. And on that note, we've got all of these tips, but then we also have a range of positive affirmations. I can't get my angle right, can I? Positive affirmations. Now, sometimes mantras are very helpful to get us through the day, and we've cut out a few of them here. For example, it's okay to take things one moment at a time. Gosh, that is so appropriate in grief. So often in grief, we're fast forwarding. Gosh, how am I going to get through this? How can I survive my future without them? They're not going to be at this moment and this moment. Now, often our brains will fast forward. And when we're thinking about the future, typically we're worrying. And the only moment we have is this one. And this is the only moment that I am responsible for. And so if I can just ground myself in this moment, it won't change my reality, but hopefully it peels away the pressure of the future and just brings me into sort of, how can I look after myself in this moment? Another one here, another example for you. My grief is a reflection of my love. Both are welcome this season. And we have a range of these kind of mantras, affirmations, as well as some, can never get my angle right, maybe I'll get it right by the end of the video, Lots of kind of exercises as well. And that's really highlighting that this workbook is very varied. We've got some kind of thought-based work for you, some emotional stuff for you to kind of engage in, some practical things, and some of those practical things are exercise-based. And definitely what I can share from my side and my experience is we notice that when people really engage in these exercises and activities is where they see change. And so if you're sitting there and thinking, gosh, I'm not sure I'll be able to kind of engage with this stuff, or if I don't know if I feel ready, even engaging in one of these pages would be a first step to honouring your grief and looking after yourself. And we have the variety there for you, so you can find something that feels like the right fit for you. We also have other things in here. Listen, I can see that there are questions coming through, and some of our team are there to answer them as well, whilst I kind of babble on. So thank you for your comments and your questions. Keep them coming. We've also got things in here like boundary plan. Got it wrong again. Boundary plan. Grief is, also a social experience. Typically what we see is that people's grief is impacted by those around them. Now, what do we know about people talking about grief in the UK and lots of other countries? Typically here in the UK, in society, we are not good at talking about grief. And what that often means is that the person who is grieving might get a lot of support initially when someone dies, and that very quickly tapers off. And so what we would see is that they may well be a bit kind of fearful of bringing up grief with others. I don't want to burden them. I don't want to upset them. And so what quickly happens is we internalise our thoughts and our feelings and our grief, and it becomes a very lonely experience. But then we also might be aware that there are people or situations around us that make it harder. Maybe they're the certain people that just don't say the right things. They come out with those platitudes that we just want to put straight in the bin. Now, you need to have some boundaries. What we definitely don't want you to do is put yourself in situations that people are making you feel worse, making this harder. This is hard enough. And this book is about helping you think about some of those boundaries as well. How can I look after myself as best as possible during this period? And it's not just about Christmas. You can take some of this stuff outside of the holiday period as well. Let's have a look. I'd love to talk you through every single page, but we just don't have the time. But this one is important. So what we have, in that first part of this workbook is so much about working with grief, looking at some of those models, thinking about tips and recommendations for looking after yourself. But there's a very important section here. Let's get it right. Get my angle right. On celebrating your loved one. Honouring them, making time to connect with them. And connection is such an important word in grief. Just because someone dies, it doesn't mean your relationship with them ends. You don't stop loving them. The love doesn't die. You don't stop being their partner, their child, their parent. And so connection is really important. Kind of first and foremost is kind of processing our grief, all that we have lost, all that means for us. But then we kind of evolve on to thinking about, how do I stay connected with this person who is not here in a meaningful way? I find myself in this way of life that I did not choose, I do not want, and yet I'm here. So how can I stay connected to them meaningfully? And we give you some ideas about that. It's very, very personal. Connection might be closing your eyes and thinking about them. Connection might be a piece of music that helps you feel them in your heart. Connection might be a place, a piece of jewellery. It can be anything, but connection is important because we need to feel connected to our loved one if we had a good relationship with them, and carry that forward with us. And so we give you some tips for that as well. And part of that might include some letter writing. Writing is a form of processing. Talking is one form, but writing is another. And if I'm being really honest, I think I'd probably classify myself as someone who isn't much of a writing person. I don't do a lot of journaling. However, the research shows us that those that even who write 20 minutes a day, 4 days a week, we see a real change, actually, even from little periods of writing across the week. We see change in mood, we see change in grief intensity, because someone is making this active time to process. And there are all sorts of different writing exercises. Writing about your loved one is just one version, but that's a wonderful one for connection as well. So we give you different versions of processing grief along the way. And then, maybe the last one I'll pull on, but bear in mind there's so much more we can pull on. Self-care checklists. Again, self-care, the one that typically goes bottom of the barrel. And when we are struggling, it is really hard to look after ourselves. Maybe we don't eat as much. Maybe we don't go out. Maybe we don't wash. Maybe our sleep is off. All of these are really normal in grief. And maybe the kindest thing you can do is stay in bed all day. But some days, maybe the kindest thing you can do is kick yourself out of bed and leave the house. And what we're looking for is some balance. Because when self-care is off, typically energy gets very low. And when energy is low, resilience is low. And we need some sense of resilience to be able to tread the water here. Those waves are hitting you hard. We need to be able to tread the water to survive. And so we help you think about some of the things that you can engage in. Even picking up 1 or 2 would be enough as a starting point. And so listen, there is so much more that I could show you in this workbook. I highly recommend it. This is a book that is charged at £15. Please know that every penny goes directly into our charitable services. So that money goes directly into funding our bereavement services, which people access for free. We do have a range of other workbooks on our website around anxiety, understanding grief, sleep. So if you're struggling with any of those, you're welcome to access those specifically via the website too on a donation basis. Please know we have lots of information. We really want you to feel supported. We also have a range of sympathy cards on our website for you to peruse, in case you know of anybody else who's going through a tough time or grieving. And we try to make sympathy cards that cut to the chase and say it as it is, rather than some of those traditional ones that feel a bit pity-based and maybe sometimes just make people feel worse. So do feel free to peruse our website and what we have available. And I'm really pleased that I could be here today to talk you through this holiday grief workbook. Please know that we have a range of support services that are available to you. And for anyone who's going to be alone on Christmas Day, I will be running an event on the morning of Christmas Day for anybody who's alone or wants a bit of connection in their grief. And so I would love to see and support you there. Thanks so much for listening to this live, and I hope your questions got answered along the way whilst I was talking along. And here you go, Holiday Grief Workbook. I highly recommend it. We really want you to feel supported in your grief. We hope to see and support you soon, and thank you so much for listening today. Bye.